So what is the collective unconscious? Is it part of the human psyche? Is it an alternate dimension? Or maybe a place where dreams are made? Today we're going to dive into some of the current thought on this, one of Jung's most seemingly mysterious concepts. So, before I get too deep into this, I want to point out something extremely important about this concept, collective unconscious. There's basically two main formulations of this. In Jung's career, he started off by thinking of the collective unconscious as biologically based, as a biologically originating part of the psyche. Now, later on in his career, he kind of dove deeper into more metaphysical approach, and this came about through his dialogue with the Nobel laureate Wolfgang Pauli, a famous physicist. We're going to focus on the biological formulation of the collective unconscious, and that's mainly because it's a little bit easier to grasp, and it's a lot less difficult to sort through the philosophical issues when you get into the metaphysical side of it. So we're just going to stay with the biological side. They aren't mutually exclusive. You can work them together, but let's just start with what we have. So here's a couple of quotes from Jung and his works where he describes what he's trying to define as the collective unconscious. In the first quote, he writes, in the archetypes in the collective unconscious, he says that the collective unconscious is a psychic system of collective, universal, and impersonal nature, which is identical in all individuals. It doesn't develop individually, but it's inherited. It consists of pre-existent forms, the archetypes, which can only become conscious secondarily and which give definite form to certain psychic contents. So that's one. And in another quotation, in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, he says, there are as many archetypes as there are typical situations in life. Endless repetition has engraved these experiences into our psychic constitution, not in the form of images filled with content, but at first only as forms without content, representing merely the possibility of certain types of perception and action. So what he's getting at here is that it's not that we inherit images or stories, but we inherit a strong tendency to form the same sorts of images and stories that you see repeated around the globe. And that the important aspect of this is that it is innate. That's the key difference. So what he's talking about here are instincts, reflexes, distinctly human responses to life. But it's not in the form of things that we remembered from learning them necessarily. Rather, it's kind of a natural human response to life experiences. I apologize for the beeping in the background, by the way. There's construction going on outside my office. Anyway, so the collective unconscious is one of the pieces of the psyche that Jung was trying to describe. Now, he says at first you've got consciousness, or what we call the ego, but then kind of underneath that is the personal unconscious, so anything that we have come across but then maybe repressed for whatever reason or forgotten about that is still necessary, by whatever reason stored there. That's all due to our personal individual history. He says, but under that, there's this collective unconscious. And that's just all the things that exist in the unconscious that are there by virtue of us being human beings and having our particular evolutionary history. So it's not inherited images, it's not mystical knowledge from the beyond, not that there's anything necessarily wrong with those sorts of ideas, but it's just not part of the scientific understanding of what the collective unconscious is supposed to be. Now, there has been some controversy over this subject for quite a while. And this all came about after Jung died in 1961. And it kind of circles around the idea of, where does this stuff coming from if not from the genome? Jung didn't know anything about genetics. He didn't know about the genome. And so once we started to learn about it, analytical psychologists have been asking the question of how the genome relates to the so-called collective unconscious. Is there some way we can show that it actually exists? And I think that's a very interesting conversation to have. I've written quite a bit about that. It does get kind of technical, so I don't want to cover too much of that here and get kind of lost in the weeds with it. Instead, though, I'd like to give more of a general impression of how I think it works. And it all kind of centers around this idea of learning. There's a lot of stuff that we do that we didn't really learn how to do necessarily, and we take it for granted. And even within the subject of things that we have learned, there is an important distinction too. And one of those is whether or not we learned it directly from teaching or from observation, or did we just sort of teach ourselves that? And I'll give you an example. So the one I typically like to use is learning to walk. Everyone who develops normally teaches themselves essentially how to walk. People who are born blind can do this, so it doesn't have anything to do with observing other people walking. We don't need to do that in order to teach ourselves how to walk. We're coming to the world with a set of basic instincts and reflexes, and there is learning involved. We learn how our body moves, and we fine-tune the nervous system will fine-tune itself through exploration, and over time we teach ourselves how to walk. Now, I think that qualifies as something that should belong to our designation as collective unconscious. And the reason is because it doesn't involve anything particular to do with our personal history apart from doing what naturally comes to a human being who was born in a terrestrial environment. And it's a little bit of a gray area there, because technically we should be thinking about things that aren't learned at all. Things that are more kind of reflexive in nature, like the famous knee reflex. You tap the knee and the knee kicks out. Nobody learns how to do that, they just do it. Another good example of something that's more like that would be the shivering response. When we encounter cold environments, the body undergoes a very complex and sophisticated response to that temperature change. It involves shifting the blood flow to the internal organs and away from the extremities, reducing blood flow to the surface, like the skin. Over time, it'll actually cause deepening of the blood vessels to a degree to help conserve heat. In extreme cold, we'll start shivering. This is a good example of a response which has nothing to do with your personal history. Nobody learns how to shiver. Nobody learns how to shift the blood flow and all that sort of stuff. It's just something the body does because it's basically ingrained in the genome. It's something that developed as a result of our species and ancestral history. So that's an example of what the collective unconscious would be from a psychological point of view. That would be when we encounter a particular environment or scenario, the psyche puts together a complex and sophisticated response and presents that to consciousness. So the debate has always been, if you take a look at something like a dream, say, and ask yourself, is this from the collective unconscious, or is this from the personal unconscious? Is this from personal history and learning, or is it due to this psychic system which we're proposing, which is entirely innate in origin? Well, in Jung's day, the very popular view at that time was the so-called blank slate idea, that everything that's in the mind is there as a result of learning, because we come into the world with this blank slate, the tabula rasa. Nobody takes this idea seriously anymore, but it was very popular in his day, and so he had quite a bit of pushback on this idea of a collective unconscious, because he's saying essentially a heretical idea that we do not have a blank slate, that we come into the world with a huge amount of psychological reactions, tendencies, responses, what have you, and that those interact with our day-to-day life, and they produce content of their own that is independent of your own personal history and journey. Kind of like shivering. You could go multiple generations of people never knowing they had the ability to shiver when it gets cold if they just lived in Hawaii or something like that. But then the 17th grandchild of whoever moves to Finland and they start shivering, they might be a little surprised by that. But it's just in the genome. It's been there the whole time. It just never encountered the proper triggering conditions. So that's what he's talking about when he talks about archetypes being triggered by particular environmental conditions. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we discuss the collective unconscious. It's a concept which I think helps clinically because it helps you to differentiate what is truly from the individual's personal history versus what is coming from the ancestral history. And it's an important distinction. And I think that if you have an experience that is largely from the collective unconscious, it can feel very otherworldly. And I think that's why a lot of mysticism gets attached to Jung's concepts. Now, Jung wasn't necessarily against mysticism, but it was outside of the scientific confines that he was trying to work within. And he didn't always stay within them either. But that's how Jung was. He was a very intuitive, exploratory kind of writer. He wanted to examine all the aspects. Nevertheless, he did want to try to stay empirical as much as he could. So, but getting back to the original point is that if I do have an experience that is largely from the collective unconscious, it can feel otherworldly, it can feel mysterious, it can feel very powerful, because it's nothing that you've encountered before. It's some character, say, that you experience in a dream or maybe a vision or fantastical reverie of some kind, and you're like, where in the heck did that come from? From the mysterious beyond, is where it might feel like it, but more likely it comes, at least partly, from our species history. And that, again, as Jung puts it, countless experiences and repetition of members of our species have caused certain types of responses to those experiences to become ingrained in the genome. Now, in his day, he was accused of Lamarckism, of saying that experiences cause these changes instead of natural selection. But he didn't know anything about those debates at the time, or he knew very little. And that really wasn't what he was getting at. And it doesn't matter because the same kind of process can still be explained within the natural selection paradigm. You don't have to go into full-blown Lamarckism. If you have a number of situations that involve cold environments, all of those individuals who can't respond to it properly will have been selected out over time. That's how something gets ingrained in the genome. Well, I think this happens psychologically too. Why? Well, because human beings are extremely psychologically focused. We have these big brains. We've got all of this cognitive activity going on. So natural selection would obviously work on that as well. So, in conclusion then, what we can say is that the collective unconscious is really the vast collection of all of the reactions, responses, tendencies towards thought and imagination that derive ultimately from our ancestral origin, that come from our species history rather than our individual history. Thanks for watching.